Roy Hinson was a trucker's trucker. A 15-year veteran of the open road, he prided himself on being able to navigate the most treacherous routes, weather the most brutal storms, and deliver his cargo on time no matter what. But as he stared at the glowing screen of his GPS, its route recalculation spinning endlessly, he felt a pang of unease he couldn't shake. His latest job was straightforward: transport a load of canned goods from Seattle to a distribution center in northern Idaho. The journey was supposed to take 6 hours, but a sudden rerouting order had sent him onto a desolate back road deep in the Pacific Northwest. It was pitch black, the only light coming from his truck's high beams cutting through the dense forest. Towering pines crowded the road, their shadows stretching like skeletal fingers. Roy glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just past midnight. His CB radio crackled faintly, white noise filling the cab. He reached for his thermos, taking a swig of coffee that had long since gone cold. The road was empty, no headlights in his mirrors, no taillights ahead. For the first time in years, he felt the oppressive weight of isolation. It wasn't just the quiet. Roy had driven through quiet plenty of times. It was the sense that something was off. A low vibration beneath his seat pulled his attention back to the road. His truck rattled as though it had hit uneven pavement, but the road ahead looked smooth. Roy slowed down, his instincts honed by years of driving. Suddenly, his GPS blared, recalculating, the robotic voice slicing through the silence. He scowled, tapping at the device. The route now displayed a sharp right turn down a dirt road. "That can't be right," Roy muttered, pulling over to double-check the instructions against his paper map. The original route had no such deviation, and this path wasn't even marked on the map. He grabbed the radio mic. "Dispatch, this is Roy. I'm on Route 87, but the GPS is sending me down some dirt road. You copy?" Static. Then faintly, "Alternate route due to bridge closure. Continue as directed." Roy's jaw tightened. The dispatch voice was garbled, and it didn't sound like Joe, his usual contact. But he knew delays meant docked pay. With a resigned sigh, he put the truck in gear and turned onto the dirt path. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees thicker and the road narrower. His headlights barely illuminated the way, bouncing off the occasional patch of frost. Roy kept his speed low, the rumble of the engine the only sound. Then he noticed something odd: fresh tire tracks. They veered off into the trees before rejoining the road, as if another vehicle had hesitated here. Half an hour later, Roy's patience was wearing thin. The dirt road twisted and turned, climbing steeper into the mountains. The GPS claimed he was still on track, but his instincts screamed otherwise. The forest felt alive, not with the usual nocturnal rustlings, but with something heavier, watching. As he rounded a bend, his headlights swept across something metallic on the side of the road. An abandoned truck. Roy slowed to a crawl. It was an old beat-up rig with no trailer. Its cab door hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. No hazard lights, no driver in sight. He pulled over, engine idling, and grabbed his flashlight. Stepping out, the cold hit him like a slap. His boots crunched on the frosty ground as he approached the vehicle. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. The flashlight beam revealed scattered belongings, a thermos, a torn jacket, and a CB radio mic dangling from its cord. On the ground near the truck's front wheel was a dark stain. Roy's stomach churned. Blood. Every instinct told him to leave, but curiosity won out. He leaned into the cab, scanning for clues. The keys were still in the ignition. A crumpled map lay on the passenger seat, marked with erratic scribbles. But before he could decipher them, a sound froze him, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the snow behind him. Roy spun around, flashlight slicing through the dark. Nothing, just the trees and the faint swirl of snowflakes. He backed away from the abandoned truck, his breath visible in the frigid air. As he climbed back into his own rig, a low growl rumbled through the woods. It wasn't an animal, it sounded mechanical, like an engine idling in the distance. He locked the doors, heart hammering, and pressed the gas. The truck roared to life, tires slipping briefly before finding traction. The dirt road seemed narrower now, the trees closing in. The growling sound followed, growing louder. In his mirrors, Roy caught a glimpse of headlights. Relief washed over him, another vehicle. He grabbed the CB mic. "This is Roy en route. An unmarked detour off 87. Anyone out there?" Static. Then faintly, "You shouldn't be here." His grip tightened on the wheel. The headlights behind him flickered, disappearing for a moment before reappearing closer. Too close. Roy's truck jolted as something bumped the trailer. "Hey, back off," he shouted, though he doubted the other driver could hear him. The pursuing vehicle, a boxy unmarked van, sped up, slamming into him again. Roy floored the accelerator, his rig groaning as it surged forward. The van kept pace, its headlights glaring in his mirrors. The road abruptly widened into a clearing. Roy spotted a dilapidated barn on the far side, its roof caved in. Desperate to shake his pursuer, he veered off the road, heading for the barn. The van followed, its tires kicking up snow and dirt. Roy skidded to a stop near the barn, grabbing a wrench from the cab before jumping out. The van halted a few yards away, its engine idling ominously. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying something long and metallic, a crowbar. "What do you want?" Roy yelled, brandishing the wrench. The figure didn't answer, advancing slowly. Then another van appeared, its headlights cutting through the trees. Roy's blood ran cold. 2 more figures emerged, both armed. He was surrounded. Thinking fast, he backed into the barn, searching for anything he could use as a weapon or an escape route. The interior was a mess of broken beams and rusted machinery. He climbed onto a loft, hoping the height would give him an advantage. The men entered, their flashlights sweeping the barn. "Come out," one called, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "We just want to talk." Roy's grip tightened on the wrench. He knew a lie when he heard one. The men spread out, their footsteps echoing. Roy spotted a ladder leading to a small window. It was risky, but it was his only shot. As the men neared his hiding spot, he made his move, climbing the ladder as quietly as he could. Halfway up, the ladder creaked. A flashlight beam swung toward him. "There he is." Roy scrambled through the window, shards of glass tearing at his jacket. He landed hard in the snow, pain jolting through his knees, but he forced himself to run. The second van blocked his truck, so he bolted toward the woods. Behind him, shouts rang out. The men were chasing him, their heavy boots crunching in the snow. Roy's breath came in ragged gasps as he weaved through the trees, branches whipping at his face. He had no plan, no idea where he was going, only the primal urge to survive. After what felt like hours, Roy stumbled upon a cabin hidden deep in the forest. Smoke curled from its chimney, and faint light glowed from the windows. He banged on the door, desperate. "Help! Please, they're after me." The door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman holding a shotgun. Her eyes widened as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Get inside, quick." She bolted the door behind him, peering through the curtains. "Who's after you?" "I don't know," Roy panted. "They ran me off the road, chased me into the woods. They've got vans." Her face paled. "Vans? Did they have any markings?" "No, just plain white." She nodded grimly. "You stumbled into something you shouldn't have. Those men, they're smugglers. Drugs, people, weapons, you name it. They use these back roads to avoid the highways." Roy Henson's voice was rough, worn out from years on the road. His eyes remained fixed on the road, his grip tight on the wheel as he navigated the twisting back roads. I could see the weight of his words hanging in the air between us like a storm cloud. I had been on the road for hours, a hitchhiker trying to make my way south, and Roy was the only trucker willing to take me along for the ride. Big mistake, I thought to myself now as I looked out the window at the endless stretch of dark pine-covered hills. The kind of place where no one would find you if you disappeared. The kind of place where no one would even care. "You say, smugglers," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "But why tell me this now?" Roy's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel tighter. He shot a quick glance at me, his face grim. "Because, kid, if you're staying on this road much longer, you're gonna regret it. Those smugglers, they don't just move their cargo, they protect it. And if you're not careful, you'll get caught in the crossfire." He exhaled sharply, his voice dropping. "Or worse." The truck creaked and groaned under the weight of its load as we turned another corner, the headlights barely piercing the thick fog that clung to the edges of the road. It felt like we were being swallowed up by the night, and I couldn't shake the growing unease in my chest. I shifted in my seat, trying to ignore the shiver that ran down my spine. "You're not the first person I've seen try to hitch a ride out here," Roy said, his eyes flicking to me before returning to the road. "Most of them don't get far." "Most of them?" I repeated, my voice low. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It felt like the truck had slowed, but I couldn't tell if it was the fog playing tricks on my mind or if we were really going slower. "Listen," Roy said, his voice tight. "There's a place up ahead, an old rest stop, a place people don't even like to talk about. It's been shut down for years, but it's where the smugglers operate. They don't want anyone poking around there. It's not just a safe house. It's a trap." I frowned, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "You're telling me I'm going to be trapped by some smugglers?" Roy's jaw clenched, his gaze dark. "You don't understand, kid. These smugglers are connected. They've got people everywhere, in every town, every back road, every inch of land out here. If you cross them, you don't just get run out of town. You disappear. And trust me, they don't just hide their bodies. They bury them. My stomach twisted. I wasn't the kind of person to jump at shadows, but the way Roy said it made me believe that whatever he was hinting at, it wasn't some simple roadside crime. Something much darker was at play here, and I was already way too deep in it. You think I should turn around? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Roy's eyes flicked toward me again, sharp and calculating. I don't know what you're doing out here, but if you want to stay alive, you should get off this road. If you've got somewhere else to go, go there. It's not too late to turn around. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to admit it, but the longer I was with Roy, the more I realized how much danger I was in. The feeling in my gut was growing, and itching in the back of my mind telling me that everything was off. The air seemed heavier now, pressing in on me as the truck rumbled through the dense trees. I could hear the wind whistling through the cracked windows, and I noticed that Roy was taking every turn like it was a matter of life and death. You keep saying trap, I said, trying to break the silence. What do you mean by that? Roy's face hardened as he stared ahead, his eyes scanning the road like he expected someone to jump out at us at any moment. The smugglers don't just smuggle things, kid. They move people, not just drugs and guns. They move bodies, live ones. I froze. I'd heard stories of human trafficking, of the horrible things people were willing to do for money, but hearing it from someone who had seen it firsthand felt like a punch to the gut. You're saying they traffic people through here? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Roy nodded grimly. People disappear all the time out here, but nobody talks about it. There's too much money in it. The people who run this operation, they're untouchable. The cops, the locals, they turn a blind eye because they're scared of what'll happen if they don't. My heart sank. I had been so focused on getting through this stretch of the country, on moving forward, that I hadn't once stopped to think about what might be waiting for me. You're saying there's nothing I can do about it? I asked, almost a challenge, though I knew the answer. Roy didn't respond immediately. He turned another corner, the headlights flickering as if the fog was playing tricks with the truck's electrical system. His face was tight with frustration, but he didn't look scared. Not yet. The only thing you can do is get out of here, he said finally, his voice low and warning. Go wherever you came from and forget this road. I don't care if you're headed to the big city or the next town over, but this place isn't worth it. Trust me. You don't want to be the next guy to disappear. I didn't know what to say. It was hard to digest, harder still to imagine myself in a place like that. Somewhere where the rules didn't matter, where the law was a joke, and the people who lived on the fringes of the world didn't even care about getting caught. Where are we even headed? I asked, trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. Farther down, Roy said curtly. There's a gas station at the next exit. You'll want to stop there, refuel, maybe grab a snack if you're still hungry, but don't linger too long. The locals? They know what's going on, but they don't say a word. No one does. I glanced out the window. The trees had grown denser, the road winding like a snake through the forest. The occasional flicker of a distant light or a faded sign barely made a dent in the overwhelming darkness. It was easy to imagine how people could get lost in a place like this. It was too quiet, too empty, and somewhere, far down the road, there was a town where people disappeared without a trace. We pulled up to a small gas station that seemed to have been abandoned for years. The pumps were rusted, the neon lights of the station flickering erratically as if they couldn't decide whether they wanted to stay on or shut off entirely. There was no one in sight, not a soul. Roy cut the engine and glanced over at me. You're on your own from here. Don't trust anyone you meet, especially not the guy in the diner. You'll know him when you see him. Who? I asked, my brow furrowing. What guy? Roy didn't answer. He just opened his door and stepped out into the cold night air. The sound of his boots crunching on the gravel was the only noise I heard as I sat there, wondering just how much of this was a warning and how much of it was reality. I didn't follow him out immediately. I stayed in the truck, staring at the station and the darkness surrounding it, thinking about what he had said. He was right, though. I wasn't cut out for this, but somehow I couldn't bring myself to leave just yet, not without seeing it through. After a moment, I grabbed my bag, took a deep breath, and stepped into the unknown. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, a black ribbon slicing through the desolate night. The glow of my dashboard cast faint shadows in the cab of my truck as I drove, the hum of the engine my only companion. The life of a long-haul trucker was one of solitude, and I relished the freedom it afforded. But that night, somewhere along Route 87, I discovered that solitude could twist into isolation, and isolation into terror. It began with a flicker in my rearview mirror. Far behind me, two faint points of light shimmered, too distant to register as anything other than headlights. I thought little of it at first. Another trucker, maybe, or some late-night traveler heading in the same direction. But as minutes turned to miles, the lights neither grew closer nor faded away. They remained steady, like they were tethered to my rig. I glanced at the mirror again, squinting into the void. No discernible shape accompanied the lights, just an unbroken stretch of blackness. I shook my head and took a sip of coffee from my thermos, dismissing the unease beginning to creep up my spine. These roads could play tricks on the mind. Loneliness and monotony did strange things to a person. The first hour passed uneventfully. The lights stayed where they were, a ghostly presence just beyond my reach. I turned on the CB radio, hoping for some chatter to break the silence. "Anyone out there on Route 87, heading northbound, mile marker 112? I asked, my voice steady but tight. Static hissed for a moment before a voice crackled through. "Yeah, I'm out here," a gruff voice replied. "Southbound though. What's up, driver?" "Just. Been seeing some strange lights behind me. Been following me for miles. Can't shake 'em." A pause. Then the voice returned. Quieter this time. "You sure it's a real truck? There's stories, you know, about a rig on these roads. Big, black, and mean. No plates, no markings. People call it the Phantom Rig." I laughed, though the sound rang hollow. "You're pulling my leg. Believe what you want," the voice said, serious now. "But if those lights get close, don't stop. Whatever you do, don't stop." The radio went silent, leaving me with only the hum of my engine and the faint glow of the mysterious headlights. I shook my head, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Tall tales and ghost stories, that's all they were. Yet the longer I drove, the harder it became to dismiss the weight of those words. An hour later, the lights behind me began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they grew closer. At first, I thought it was just another driver finally catching up, but as the minutes ticked by, it became clear this wasn't any ordinary vehicle. The headlights moved with unnatural precision, closing the gap between us with eerie smoothness. I glanced at the speedometer, 70 miles per hour, yet the truck behind me was gaining ground effortlessly, its lights now glaring in my mirrors. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel, and a bead of sweat slid down my temple. "All right, buddy," I muttered under my breath. "Let's see what you've got." I downshifted and pressed the accelerator to the floor. My rig roared in protest as it surged forward, the speedometer climbing to 80, then 85. But no matter how fast I went, the other truck stayed with me, its headlights locked onto my trailer like a predator stalking its prey. My pulse quickened as I switched lanes, hoping to lose it. The black truck mirrored my movements with unsettling precision. I veered into the right lane, then back to the left, but it didn't falter. The lights were so close now that they lit up the entire interior of my cab, casting harsh shadows across the dashboard. I grabbed the CB radio again, my voice trembling. "This is northbound 17. I'm being tailed by a black rig with no plates, no markings. Can anyone confirm?" Oh, silence. Then a burst of static, followed by a different voice, low and distorted. "Keep driving, driver. You don't want to know what's behind you." The radio cut out completely. The road ahead blurred as I focused on the rearview mirror, my chest tight with dread. Suddenly, the headlights behind me shifted. They swerved into the oncoming lane, roaring forward until the truck was beside me. For the first time, I saw it clearly. It was massive, a black, unmarked rig with a towering cab and an impossibly long trailer. The metal gleamed under the moonlight, but there were no logos, no identifying marks. The windows of the cab were dark, impenetrable. It was as though the truck itself was alive, a hulking beast of steel and shadow. The Phantom rig matched my speed, its engine a low growl that seemed to vibrate in my chest. For a moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us, hurtling through the night. Then, with a deafening roar, it swerved toward me. I yanked the wheel to the right, my tires screeching as I narrowly avoided a collision. The Phantom rig veered back into its lane, its headlights flickering like a predator's eyes. I slammed on the gas, my truck lurching forward as I tried to put distance between us. But the black rig was relentless, its hulking form looming in my mirrors. Up ahead, I spotted an off-ramp and made a split-second decision. I yanked the wheel, my trailer swaying dangerously as I took the turn at full speed. The off-ramp led to a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense forest. My headlights carved a path through the trees, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. For a brief moment, I thought I'd lost it. The road was deserted, the silence almost deafening after the chaos of the highway. But then, in the distance, I saw them, two pinpricks of light, growing brighter by the second. The phantom rig was still with me. The forest closed in around me as I pushed my truck to its limits, the engine whining in protest. The black rig barreled after me, its headlights illuminating the trees in a sickly glow. I could feel it gaining on me, its presence a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest. Suddenly, the road split into two paths. Without thinking, I veered left, my tires skidding on the gravel. The phantom rig followed, its massive frame tearing through the underbrush like it was nothing. I glanced at the rearview mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The truck's headlights flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing in the cab. A shadowy figure, too tall and thin to be human, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. I tore my gaze away and focused on the road, my heart pounding. The trees blurred past me as I sped through the forest, the black rig relentless in its pursuit. I could feel its engine rumbling, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Then, without warning, the headlights vanished. The sudden darkness was jarring, and I slammed on the brakes, my truck skidding to a halt. I sat there, my hands trembling on the wheel, straining to see through the gloom. The road ahead was empty, the forest eerily silent. But I knew it wasn't over. A loud crash shattered the silence, and I whipped around to see the black rig barreling toward me from the opposite direction. Its headlights blazed like fire, and its engine roared with an otherworldly fury. I threw the truck into reverse, my tires spinning as I backed away. My trailer jackknifed, the steel beams screeching as they shifted. The phantom rig didn't slow. It was coming for me, and I knew that if it hit me, there would be nothing left. In a last-ditch effort, I swerved off the road, my truck crashing through the underbrush and coming to a jarring halt against a tree. The black rig thundered past, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I sat there gasping for breath, the forest silent around me. My truck was damaged, but I didn't care. I was alive. When I finally managed to get back on the road, the phantom rig was gone. The rest of the drive was uneventful, the highway empty save for the occasional passing car. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere out there, the phantom rig was waiting. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on Route 87. Maybe it was just a tall tale brought to life, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is this: if you ever see those headlights in your mirror, don't stop, don't look, just drive. My name is Jake Ryder, and I've been a trucker for the better part of 20 years. I've hauled everything from livestock to electronics, but the load I picked up that night, the one heading out to a remote town in Wyoming, was just an ordinary shipment of furniture. At least that's what the manifest said. It was late, and I was on a tight schedule, so I didn't bother inspecting the cargo too closely. I've learned that asking too many questions often leads to answers you don't want. The dispatcher handed me the paperwork at the yard in Denver, saying, "Get this to Ashton by morning. They've been waiting weeks for this order." I grunted in acknowledgement and climbed into my rig, a reliable Peterbilt 379 that had seen its fair share of miles and memories. The engine roared to life, and the cab filled with the comforting hum of diesel power. I punched Ashton into the GPS, but it didn't recognize the town. That wasn't unusual. Small towns often don't show up on standard maps. The dispatcher had given me directions written on a scrap of paper, another red flag I ignored. The highway stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast emptiness of the plains. The first few hours were uneventful, just me, the road, and the occasional crackle of static from the CB radio. Around midnight, I pulled into a rest stop to grab some coffee and stretch my legs. The place was deserted except for a single car parked in the shadows. Its driver was slumped over the steering wheel, possibly asleep, but I decided not to investigate. Truckers learn early on to mind their own business. By 1 a.m., I was back on the road, cruising through a patch of dense forest. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the treetops. The directions said to turn off the highway onto a smaller road about 50 miles ahead. When I reached the turn, the paved highway gave way to a narrow gravel path barely wide enough for my rig. The trees closed in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My headlights cut through the darkness, but the beams seemed weaker than usual, swallowed up by the oppressive black. Something about the road felt wrong. The gravel crunched under my tires, but the sound was muted, as if the forest itself were absorbing the noise. I shook off the unease. I'd been on plenty of back roads before, and they all had their quirks. Still, I kept my speed low, navigating the tight turns and dips with caution. The first sign of trouble came about 20 minutes later. A figure appeared on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. It was a man, dressed in dirty overalls and holding a shovel. He didn't move as I passed, just stood there staring at me with hollow eyes. My gut told me to keep driving, so I did, but I couldn't shake the image of his expressionless face. About 5 miles further, I spotted a gas station. It looked old, the kind of place that hadn't been updated since the 1950s. The neon sign flickered weakly, spelling out gas in uneven letters. I decided to stop, figuring I could top off the tank and maybe get some clarity about the directions. As I stepped out of the truck, the chill in the air hit me like a slap. It wasn't just cold, it felt unnatural, like the air itself was wrong. The station's interior was dimly lit, and the shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans of food and faded candy wrappers. A man stood behind the counter, his face obscured by the brim of a cowboy hat. "Need something?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm heading to Ashton. Am I on the right road?" The man's head tilted slightly, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he said, "Ashton? Ain't nobody been out that way in years. You sure that's where you're headed?" "That's what my paperwork says," I said, holding up the manifest. He didn't look at it. "Be careful out there. Roads get tricky at night." I nodded, paid for the fuel, and left. As I climbed back into the truck, I noticed the man watching me through the window. His expression was unreadable, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Back on the road, the forest seemed even darker than before. The gravel turned to dirt, and the path became narrower, forcing me to slow down. The GPS was useless, and the directions from the dispatcher were vague at best. The trees loomed closer, their branches scratching against the sides of the trailer like skeletal fingers. The uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger, but I pressed on. Around 3 a.m., I saw another figure on the road, this time a woman in a tattered dress. She was standing in the middle of the path, her back to me. I honked the horn, but she didn't move. My stomach churned as I slowed to a stop. Rolling down the window, I called out, "Hey, you okay?" She turned slowly, her face pale and her eyes empty. Before I could say anything else, she let out a blood-curdling scream and sprinted into the woods. My heart raced as I hit the gas, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever the hell that was. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the forest like a snake. The clock on the dashboard read 4:15 a.m. when the truck's engine sputtered. No, I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The engine died completely, and the truck coasted to a stop. I tried restarting it, but the ignition only clicked. The fuel gauge read full, and everything else seemed fine, but the truck wouldn't budge. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the night. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. As I checked under the hood, a low growl echoed from the woods. I froze, shining the flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. My instinct screamed at me to get back in the cab, so I did, locking the doors behind me. Minutes turned into hours as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel and staring into the darkness. Just when I thought the night couldn't get any worse, the CB radio crackled to life. "Jake Ryder," a voice whispered, sending chills down my spine. "You shouldn't be here." "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. There was no response, just static. Then the whisper came again. "Leave the cargo, walk away." "Screw this," I muttered, grabbing my cell phone to call for help. Of course, there was no signal. I was completely alone, or so I thought. The flashlight beam caught movement outside the truck. A group of shadowy figures emerged from the woods surrounding the rig. They didn't move like normal people. Their movements were jerky, almost mechanical. Panic set in as I reached for the tire iron under the seat. The figures began pounding on the doors, their hands leaving smears of some dark, viscous substance on the glass. "Stay back," I shouted, swinging the tire iron as one of them climbed onto the hood. Its face was featureless, just a blank, smooth surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. The thing slammed its hand against the windshield, cracking the glass. Desperation took over. I climbed into the sleeper cab and pushed open the emergency hatch, scrambling onto the roof. The figures were all around, their guttural growls filling the air. I jumped down and ran into the woods, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I stumbled through the underbrush. The growls followed, growing louder with each passing second. I tripped and fell, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. Scrambling to my feet, I turned to see the figures closing in, their blank faces glowing faintly in the darkness. Just when I thought I was done for, a blinding light enveloped the area. The growl stopped and the figures froze. A deafening roar filled my ears as the ground shook violently. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, the figures were gone, and the forest was eerily still. I made my way back to the truck, half expecting it to be gone too. To my surprise, it was still there, the engine idling as if nothing had happened. I didn't question it. Climbing into the cab, I threw the rig into gear and sped down the road, not stopping until I reached the first signs of civilization. When I finally delivered the cargo, the receiver didn't even look surprised by my haggard appearance. He simply signed the paperwork and said, "You made it." Not many do. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. All I cared about was getting as far away from Ashton as possible. To this day, I've never taken another delivery without checking the destination first. Some roads are better left untraveled, and some cargo is better left undelivered. My name is Ryan Mercer, and if you've spent any time on the open road, you've probably heard my name whispered in truck stop diners or passed along in grainy CB radio chatter. I wasn't always the guy with the story, the one people lower their voices to talk about. But after the run I'm about to tell you about, everything changed. I've never shared this in full, but I figure it's time. Maybe it'll stop someone else from making the same mistake. It started with an ordinary job, a midnight haul through the Appalachian Mountains. The load was straightforward enough, industrial equipment bound for a factory in a small Pennsylvania town. The route was clear, weather forecasts were promising, and my Peterbilt 389 was running smooth. Everything should have been routine, but from the moment I pulled onto Route 74, things started feeling wrong. Route 74 isn't marked on most maps. It's an old mountain pass, winding and steep, but a lot of truckers use it to shave an hour or two off the trip. I'd driven it before without issue, but this time was different. The air felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on the cab. Even the engine seemed to hum at a slightly lower pitch. I shook it off. Long hauls can play tricks on your mind, especially late at night. I'd been driving for about an hour when I noticed something strange. The mile markers, small reflective signs that dot the side of the road, weren't adding up. I'd passed one that said mile 12, then another that said mile 8. At first I thought I'd just missed a few, but the further I drove, the more erratic they became. Mile 18, mile 3, mile 15. It made no sense. I reached for the CB radio to see if anyone else was on the road. "Breaker, breaker, this is Mercer hauling eastbound on Route 74. Anyone out there?" Static. No response. That wasn't unusual. Route 74 was remote, and cell service was non-existent. Still, the silence felt oppressive, like the road had swallowed up all sound. The only noise was the steady rumble of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional groan of the trailer shifting behind me. Then my headlights caught something odd. The road ahead seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off pavement on a summer day. Except it wasn't hot. If anything, it was colder than it should have been. The rippling effect grew more pronounced as I approached, and for a brief moment, I considered turning around. But the road was too narrow, and there was no safe place to pull a U-turn with a fully loaded rig. I pressed on, the ripples giving way to what looked like a slight distortion in the air, almost like a film overlay. When I crossed through it, the temperature in the cab dropped so sharply that I could see my breath. The dashboard clock blinked out for a second, then reset itself to 0. My headlights flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went pitch black. When the lights came back on, the road looked different. The pavement was cracked and uneven, overgrown with weeds in some spots. Trees pressed in closer, their gnarled branches clawing at the sides of the trailer. The familiar yellow road lines were faded, barely visible. Even the air smelled different, damp and earthy, with a faint metallic tang that set my teeth on edge. My gut told me to stop, to get out and check my surroundings, but my hands stayed glued to the wheel. Something about the place felt hostile, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I'd driven maybe 5 more miles when I spotted a gas station up ahead. It looked ancient, with a rusted metal roof and a hand-painted sign that read Harlan's in peeling white letters. Relief washed over me. Maybe they had a phone, or at least someone who could tell me where I was. I pulled into the gravel lot, killed the engine, and climbed down from the cab. The air was eerily still, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The gas pumps were the old-fashioned kind with manual levers, and the windows of the station were so dirty I couldn't see inside. I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. That's when I noticed the faint humming noise. It wasn't coming from the gas station, but from somewhere behind it. Curious, I walked around the building, my boots crunching on the gravel. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and as I rounded the corner, I saw a faint glow coming from a shed about 20 yards away. The shed was small and rickety, its wooden planks warped with age. The glow seeped through the cracks, pulsing faintly. Against my better judgment, I approached. The humming was almost hypnotic, like it was pulling me forward. I reached out to open the door, but the moment my hand touched the handle, the glow disappeared, and the humming stopped. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to get back to the truck. But before I could move, the door creaked open on its own. Inside was nothing but darkness, no glow, no humming, just an empty void that seemed to stretch on forever. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw them, footprints, dozens of them, leading from the shed to the gas station and back again. They were faint, barely more than impressions in the dirt, but they were there. And they weren't mine. I turned and sprinted back to the truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, the engine wouldn't start. The key turned, but all I got was a grinding sound that made my stomach churn. I tried again. Nothing. That's when the radio crackled to life. "You shouldn't have stopped," a voice whispered, low and gravelly. My blood turned to ice. "Keep driving, Mercer. Don't look back." The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine roared to life on its own. I didn't question it. Slamming the truck into gear, I peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind me. The gas station disappeared in my rearview mirrors, swallowed up by the encroaching darkness. The road ahead was worse than before. Potholes and cracks threatened to tear the tires apart, and the trees seemed to loom even closer, their branches forming grotesque shapes in the headlights. The air inside the cab felt heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. My hands were slick with sweat, and the wheel felt unnaturally warm under my grip. The radio crackled again. "Don't stop, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear." "Who is this?" I shouted, but there was no response, just static. Then the whispers started. They weren't coming from the radio, but from somewhere inside the cab, faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the engine, but they grew louder, overlapping until they were a cacophony of voices. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, harsh and guttural, but their tone was unmistakably hostile. I turned up the radio trying to drown them out, but it didn't help. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding me, suffocating me, and then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Not a shadow or a trick of the light, but something solid, something real. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, and floored the gas. The figure didn't move. It didn't flinch. It just stood there, waiting. At the last second, I swerved, the trailer fishtailing behind me. The tires screamed as they fought for traction, and the rig skidded dangerously close to the edge of the road. When I glanced in the mirrors, the figure was gone, but the whispers were louder now, almost deafening. I wanted to stop, to scream, but the voice from the radio echoed in my mind. "Don't stop." So I kept driving. The road stretched on forever, a nightmare that refused to end. The dashboard clock blinked 0 over and over, mocking me. The air grew colder, the trees denser, until it felt like the road itself was trying to trap me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The trees parted, the pavement smoothed out, and I found myself back on the familiar highway. The clock reset to 3:47 a.m., and the CB radio was silent. I pulled into the factory an hour later, shaking and exhausted. The workers were loading trucks under bright floodlights, their chatter and laughter jarringly normal. When I stepped out of the cab, my legs almost gave out beneath me. One of the workers, a guy in a yellow vest, walked over. "You okay, man?" he asked. "Yeah," I lied. "Long night." He gave me a curious look, but didn't press. As they unloaded the trailer, I sat on the steps of the cab, staring at the road behind me. It looked ordinary now, just another stretch of asphalt winding through the mountains. But I knew better. Whatever I'd driven through, whatever I'd seen, it wasn't normal. And it wasn't over. To this day, I don't take Route 74. I've warned other drivers about it, but most just laugh it off. Some have even tried it themselves. Most of them come back with stories about a rough road and nothing more. But a few never come back at all.